Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're glad to have you. Um, Throughout this webinar, we're going to have several polls like you were just seeing on your screen. So if you weren't able to get the link down, it's in the chat, and it'll show up on the slides throughout. We're glad to have Patrick with us today. He's going to be sharing his knowledge with us. Patrick has been passionate about technology his whole life, and it has influenced his career, his social life, his private life, everything. For the last 25 years, he's been working to problem solve for software solutions on a broad range of business needs. He's also spent a lot of time working with dynamic teams to provide the right solution, the right fit for what clients are looking for. Outside of the office, he can be also found in the woods, in the wild. He's an avid outdoorsman and enjoys spending time outside with his wife and two kids. So Patrick, take it away.
Thanks so much. So again, I'm Patrick Turner, and I actually got started coding when I was a kid. My dad dropped me off at the Radio Shack with my brother when I was about 10 years old, and I instantly fell in love. And as Anna mentioned, I've been building software professionally for about 25 years, 15 years of those working in corporate America, and the majority of that, about 10 years in the medical device industry. And then for the last 10 years, I've been running a software development shop of about 100 people based here in North Carolina and then Romania. So you can imagine I'm all about distributed agile, and that's something I also like to talk about a lot. So we were acquired by Globant back in October, which was really exciting because Globant really is driven by culture, and they believe it's the key to their long-term success, and I've always believed that myself as well. So it's really exciting to be a part of this organization, continuing really our mission to deliver great software. So on to DevOps, though, it's really been probably the biggest shift that I've seen in my career since we moved to the web in the 90s. And as we were talking about with the word cloud earlier, culture is a really big part of that. So I will mention if you're looking for me and anything else I have to say about DevOps and culture and a lot of other topics, you can pretty much find me everywhere at Turnipf, Turnepf, and I also am featured on the Globant blog as well, talking about DevOps and cultures, and I'll give you that link in a few minutes as well if you want to check out that as well. So again, as Anna mentioned, certainly ask questions in the chat window. Juggling balls here, but I'll do my best to keep track of those as well. And if not, we will have a Q&A session at the end when we'll try to answer any questions that time permits, and questions assuming I can answer them. So really, to get started, we've all heard it worked on my machine. And the reality is more than 80% of projects fail. And it's usually because of poor communications. Development is not talking to product, and no one's talking to the QA team. And certainly operations finds out what they have to do very late in the game. And very often what this ends up with is not the best software delivered to the organization. So let's see. So really though, the key is that with QA, they don't know where to test it, or even how to test it, or what to test. Operations typically hasn't had good instructions for deployment, but of course they get blamed when the deployment goes poorly. And ultimately DevOps is intended to get everyone rowing in the same direction. That's what we're after. So as I mentioned earlier, my goal has always been to deliver the best possible software. And my thing is I want to build stuff that when I go home at Christmas, I can show my mom, and something I'm going to be proud about. And that's always been something we're looking for. And we were talking about Agile earlier, and we were looking at that word cloud. And if you're really doing Agile right in your organization, it's had a positive impact on your culture. And the way I look at DevOps is extending those benefits of Agile throughout the rest of the organization beyond just development and QA. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about a cultural mindset. So we talked earlier about defining DevOps. And I have gone around and around about this, and this is my definition. So if you find something else someplace else that contradicts this, that's cool. But ultimately, the way I look at it is DevOps integrates and automates processes, creating transparency so that people can build the best possible software. And again, that's what we're really after. And so DevOps extends that culture of transparency that Agile did for the development team, both upstream and downstream. And you'll notice so far, I really haven't talked about tools, and that's really by design. So there are lots of tools and the tool sets are changing. There's some things that are bubbling to the top in terms of being, considered best practice around DevOps. But ultimately, the tools are not as important as the people are in the process. And again, it's extending that agile culture of communication and collaboration throughout the organization. So again, to kind of level set for me, so I can make sure I'm talking about the things you guys are interested in, poll. And again, I think Anna's put a link to that in the chat window, but you can also just go to pollev.com/Globant, or you can text Globant if you're in the US to 22333. And let's see what your biggest challenge is. So is it education, culture, time, tools, or no plan? So when I give this one, I normally do see a lot of no plan, but wow, you guys are realizing culture is a big challenge. So no doubt that's the case. Education, which is probably a function of time as well, right? Just having the time to learn what you need to do. And so clearly, so far, you guys are really showing me that culture is your challenge. So hopefully I'll be able to help you guys with some solutions to that today. And so education's popping back up there, but a lot of you are saying there's just no plan. And I think I might give you a couple of tools about that today. So lots of good responses here so far. But definitely you guys are realizing it's a culture shift and no doubt about that. So hopefully I'll help you out with that a little bit today. So, all right. So clearly we have here culture is the real issue that you guys are facing, and not having a plan or an education, which I presume are probably tightly related to each other, are coming in, kind of going back and forth with second place there. So that's true. I noticed too, when I used to present this, tools was always one of the high marks here. And from my perspective, is in the last several years, as we've been implementing DevOps in our organization, the tools have become a little bit more clear about which are winning the game so far. I used to say that 80% of the market is using Docker, and the other 20% of the market's not using containers at all. I think that's probably the case with a lot of the tools these days. All right, so again, you guys are setting me up. Thanks for that. It's definitely culture is the game today. So again, historically, we've had these traditional process silos. So we've had development that's been working without talking to anyone else, just taking their tasks and going at it. Quality assurance that's been just taking a total guess as to about how to do their job. Then operations, again, you say, hey, I'll give you guys some free pizza tonight if you'll stay late and do a deployment for us, which they didn't know about that morning when they came into the office. So I think those guys may be the ones I feel the worst for. But classic thing with QA is they're being asked to test, but very often they don't know what's coming down the pipeline to test. They don't know how to test it, or even where they can go find an instance that they can test. And so one of the opportunities with DevOps is to really help with some of these issues, providing operations much more heads up about what's coming down the pike to be deployed and how it needs to be deployed through automated forces, as well as QA, not having to even ask development about where or how or what to test as they get started. And so the key really is that DevOps is about breaking down those silos and connecting people and actually getting them to talk to each other and improving their communication. So I'm going to define the process, again, how I see it, and I'm going to talk about some different examples of how we break down those silos. But before we get started, I want to kind of see the first topic I'm going to be talking about, which is unit tests, and I want to see how far along you guys are in terms of implementing unit tests in your organization. And so again, we have, if you want to check the chat window, there's an easy link. Okay, good, we're already starting to see some answers here. So right off the bat, we have some people who are being honest and saying, what is unit testing? So thanks for being honest about that. I'll give you guys at least the 30-second definition of what unit testing is. Interestingly, almost 50% of you have decent coverage. And I feel like every time I give this presentation, I see a little bit more people saying they have good coverage. And so I want to say 50% is probably the best I've ever seen in terms of that. So it's starting to tell us maybe how DevOps really is maturing in our organization. 30% of you are saying you're just getting started. Not at all surprised about that. Hopefully I can give you guys some ways to actually kickstart a little bit how you get started. And 3% of you are saying you got 100% coverage. My answer to this one is it must be a very early project. I know most of us are working on projects that are at least a couple of years old. Some of us a couple of decades old, right? And if you've got 100% coverage, my guess is that the project hasn't been around for very long, and you were smart and got started with unit testing from the beginning, which is certainly the best approach. So again, good answers all across the board there. Thanks for those responses. So I'm going to again talk about this whole continuum of development and how I look at this. We're going to start with actually the development process, and specifically, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about unit testing. And really, this was our first big challenge as an organization, was how do we get started with unit testing? And really the reason we decided that was an important part in the continuum of how we got started with unit testing is because if you're going to do continuous integration, continuous deployment, you really have to have good unit test coverage. And so for those of you who said, I don't even know what unit test is, that's okay. It's really actually pretty simple fundamentally. But unit testing is essentially code that tests code. So for example, if you have a piece of code and it's doing addition, your unit test might pass 1 and 1 into that piece of code, and the unit test will expect 2 to come out the other end of that unit test. And if that passes, then it says then it's okay. And so essentially, you want to have unit testing all areas of the software, because that's really going to be a first stab at making sure you have good quality software. And ultimately, really, this is the most immediate culture change that you're going to see in an organization. And I can say this because I was a heads down coder for many, many years. But as developers, we were kind of used to just trying to churn through code and throw it over the wall to QA and let them find those problems. But the great thing about unit testing is it really puts the developer into a more direct responsibility for for having high quality code, because they need to have that high quality code just to pass those unit tests, so that by the time it gets to the QA, there's already been some automated testing right off the bat based on what the developers built out. So we started off with a goal of about 80% coverage, and like some of you said, some of our let's say younger projects do have 100% coverage. Some of our older ones we've actually retrofitted and gone back and built unit tests around the whole application. Some of the other ones have a lot lower coverage even after years of writing unit tests, and quite frankly, that's because of issues that you find once you get started. But ultimately, really, it was tough to get started with our developers because we want to be writing code. We don't necessarily want to be doing other activities. So we have all sorts of excuses for this. We say we don't have time to do that. We don't really understand what unit tests are. Or maybe there's no way we can build those because the application has poor architecture, which is certainly a real challenge. But ultimately, you want to make sure that your organization, your development team, are building unit tests and that you do have good unit test coverage, because you want to build a culture where those developers actually have a direct responsibility for quality. So wanted to share with you one of our culture hacks. This is the first of a few hacks I'm going to give you today. But again, the hardest part for us with unit tests was just getting started. And really what we came up with was a creative way just to have people get started, and we actually had a contest. So we had, for every developer that could show during their code review that they'd actually built one unit test, just one, into their application, they got to throw their name in a hat, and then we gave away an iPad with a random drawing from those names in the hat. So it got everyone to start thinking about how can I put a unit test into their code. And as a side result, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that will show things like architecture issues. So if you have a huge chunk of monolithic code and that one function does a lot of different things, sometimes you find it's really hard to build a unit test to that, and might give you some ideas on how you should be breaking that application up into smaller chunks. So it can give you some really good ideas about how to fix some applications from an architectural perspective. But really, at the end of the day, we got people starting to think about that, a little incentive there. They started to understand how really fundamentally a unit test is not all that complicated. And already, it started helping with quality from the very beginning. So next, I'm going to jump over to source code management, talk a little bit about that. As I mentioned, I've been building software for a long time. And I think when I got started, there was really no such thing as source code management. I had a tape drive I was saving my code to. But ultimately, once we did start implementing source code management, everyone was working in that same code set. And so when it was time to do a production deployment, you all got together and was like, okay, what's ready to go live? And you were trying to figure out which pieces of the code you had to comment out. And it certainly got complicated. And if you were working in a distributed team, which I did most of my professional career, it really became a nightmare trying to keep up with that. So we actually up with this whole idea of how to have branches for development. And it certainly was a thing, but at the end of the day, we were all working in the same branch. And so as a result, we were all stepping on each other's toes. If something got pushed to production that wasn't quite ready for prime time, it was the blame game. We were all pointing fingers. And it made for a terrible culture just within the development team, and certainly for bad software as well. So as part of our DevOps implementation, we really embraced feature branching. And so feature branching is really great because first off, it's this self-organizing process. So again, self-organizing sounds very agile, right? But ultimately, the team gets to decide how are we going to do our branching. Is it going to be based on a feature? Is it going to be a user story? Are we going to put entire epics into their own branches? But ultimately, the team is taking the time to come up with a good strategy for what works for them. And by the way, a lot of people feel like all they have to do is install Git and it's all going to make this wonderful source code management problem go away. And that's just really not the case. If you want to have cleaner builds, easier deployments, and less finger pointing, you have to really put together a strategy. And by the way, my favorite thing about this new approach of feature branching is the ability to actually do bug fixes with the branch as well. So while all that code that's not ready for prime time is sitting over in those feature branches, you can have your bug fix. If something comes up in production, we got to do a quick fix today. It's really easy to do a branch, pull out, fix that bug, put it back into the master code branch, and then that's going to automatically flow back into those feature branches as we get started. So it's really great. Now, in terms of the issue that we had here, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes when we got started initially, we thought, oh, we're a small team. Maybe the team might feel like they don't need to worry about a strategy about how you're actually going to do your feature branching. But it's what we really learned is that it's very important that the team take the time to come up with the feature branching strategy before you start coding. Because if you want to make sure that you're not pushing the wrong code to production or stepping on each other's toes in any other way, you have to take the time to actually come up with that strategy in advance. Otherwise, you're really not leveraging the power of the distributed repository. And so this also is going to give us a better culture of transparency. And ultimately, it's going to change how you work as a development team and change the culture in your organization. So I'm going to jump over to QA. I don't know, let's see, do we have any questions over here right now? So
there are a few. I don't know if you want to take some.
I'll jump in here and just grab a random question. So how DevOps integrates Agile methodologies, and in this case, how is it related to TDD? So, again, I think of this in the sense of DevOps is just giving better visibility to everyone of what's going on. And of course, part of Agile is, in the same way that you want your business process owners and your proxy product owners and your product owners involved in those daily stand-ups, you want everyone involved in determining, for example, in that last slide, what your branching strategy is going to be, how that code is going to be organized in order so that we all understand how that affects our backlog and how we determine what we're going to be doing sprint to sprint. Because those same strategies and, for example, coming up with the source code management are going to impact how we actually go live with production releases as well. So let's see, I thought unit tests and branching strategy was up to the developers. why or how is DevOps involved? So that's a great question. And so again, I'll read the question again. So Gabriel says, I thought unit tests and branching strategy was up to the developers. Why and how are DevOps involved? So I really look at this as DevOps is really the responsibility of the developers as well as the sysadmins. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But the key from my perspective is that they need to be all working together to determine that branching strategy so that we're planning our releases together. Everyone is aware of what's going into those releases as they come out. And certainly, I think unit tests are something that the development team is solely responsible for. That branching strategy is something that the whole team needs to consider, because while you're talking about releases, you need to be talking about what's going into deployments so that your branching strategy aligns with that deployment strategy. So again, I'm going to jump back in, talk a little bit about the QA cycle. And really, ultimately, DevOps automation enables QAs to add more value, and it changes the role of the QA. But ultimately, it's going to increase their impact on the quality of the software, and it's going to make better software. So traditionally, and by the way, the folks that come up to my presentation at the end are very often the QAs because they really love to hear this part. But traditionally, testers, when we actually started having people who had that defined job, were usually people who were power users. Maybe they came out of customer service, but their amazing ability was that they were always the ones breaking the app. So you had Joe over there in customer service who was always calling you up saying, hey, this app is not doing X, Y, or Z. You recruit Joe to come in and be a QA. And that was really effective, and it was great. And it was better than us just working in a silo. But ultimately, it was just manual testing. It's today what we would call smoke testing. Now we have a great name for it, but back then, it was just banging on the application until we were able to actually make it break. And so now I really view QA automation as something that is part of the DevOps cycle, because we want to have that deployment line kicking off that automation, and it becomes part of that whole cycle for us. So whether it's test scripts that are just testing the UI, or performance testing to make sure that the code that the developers are building can actually handle the stresses that it's going to be faced with, or even other things like security testing that can happen automagically through the miracle of continuous integration and continuous deployment. So again, automation, whether it's regression, performance testing, whatever that case may be, allows the QA to really increase their focus on the new features. So with automation, we take that grunt work and move it over to the machine and let the machine do that regression testing, assuming we were even doing regression testing before. And so now, like the same way that our engineers aren't just throwing bugs over the wall, now the QA isn't having to deal with silly bugs that unit tests can find, or having to deal with doing things like regression and performance testing that we can now automate with the machine. And ultimately, what that enables our QAs to do is to spend more time communicating with product owners, product managers, users, et cetera, so to make sure that they're really adding value. But ultimately, traditionally, we've seen QA work as being this tedious and manual process, and certainly, as I said, not something that was formal. And now with DevOps and automating these processes, it's turning the QA from being just a code breaker to actually being a value maker. I will say one of the challenges that we have had and continue to have is that not all QAs necessarily want to do things like writing the scripts to do QA automation. That maybe not be why they got in their job. A lot of them are interested in that because that's a great career path for them to really expand and make, again, what they do more valuable. And so not all QAs will jump over the fence and become QA automation engineers and things of this nature. But certainly it enables those people, again, to add more value even in their roles if they're not doing the scripting around the actual automated processes, because a lot of the things they would normally do through smoke testing is now being done by the machine. So let's see, I'm going to pop over here and answer a quick question. So doesn't branching create conflicts when integrating into the trunk? It certainly does, and that's one of the challenges that you have to deal with when you're doing a pull request through feature branching. But I would argue that while you do have conflicts when you're doing that pull request to put your chunk of code into the master branch. It's a lot better process for the machine to find those conflicts than for those conflicts to make it out into production and break stuff in production. So it's a great question, but I think it's a good trade-off. And then someone's asking about sharing the presentation, and I believe this presentation, Anna, can you address that?
Yes, so I was responding in the chat. Sorry, that's why I was late.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We'll be sending the video recording after the webinar, so
Good.
don't worry.
All right, good deal. So again, I think earlier during our word cloud, if you missed that, we definitely had some people saying that deployment was what they thought of when they thought about DevOps, and I think that's the case with most people, and it is definitely the heart of DevOps. But in my mind, and you notice in my continuum here, I don't think of deployment as just the single action of getting the application out into production. I really think of it as something that's multi-step, because you also are deploying at points, for example, where QA can test it, or where you can put it into stage for your business process owners to test it as well. And because that's automated now, it's a lot easier to get those deployments done into those areas instead of just waiting until it's going out of production. But ultimately, continuous integration, from my mind, is about getting clean, predictable builds. So just like that question earlier about feature branching, yes, it does absolutely add potentially some overhead up front, but what you're going to end up with at the end of the day, again, is a clean, predictable build that you're ready to go for QA to test, to go to stage for your end users to have a look at, as well as when you're actually deploying to production. So once you have unit tests in place that are testing the code, you're automating the machine with security tests, automated regression tests, and all that sort of stuff. It makes that process of deploying a much cleaner process. And again, my goal is to have great software that I'll be proud to show to anybody, especially my mom. And so that's what we're going to do with the machine, is really shoot for that goal. So again, simple problems such as missing dependencies, environment configurations, and all that have contributed to this whole "it worked on my machine" syndrome. And adding continuous integration and continuous delivery make sure that we have deployments that are predictable, stress-free, and really it's increasing transparency across the organization, because if you've implemented the tools and the strategy properly, everyone in the organization knows what's going on in that deployment, and it's going to be predictable. And ultimately, it's going to eliminate that "it worked on my machine" scenario. And so wonderful things like QAs can actually test builds without asking the developer to say, hey, can you deploy that someplace for me to do it, because the machine's automatically doing it. Also doing really awesome things like enabling us to do orchestration, which I'll talk about in a minute. But ultimately, the product owner, the QA, the engineer, everyone involved knows what's going on, and they're going to know how and where and when those deployments are going to happen, and they're going to happen predictably. And that's really the wonderful part about all this. So as part of the deployment, we very often talk about ops. And so, I kind of break this up into a few areas. Containers like Docker, infrastructure as code, as well as monitoring orchestration, which again, we're allowing the machine to automate these processes to provide more predictable deployments and more predictable environments. So the real key, and I think this is what someone was asking earlier, it's kind of the question of, isn't this changing roles a little bit? And my answer is, yeah, absolutely. But the key here is that the software development team, and specifically the architect and the sysadmin, have to work together to define the environment. It's no longer just the sysadmin saying, hey, development team, this is the environment I'm going to spin up for you, good luck, or the software engineer and the team putting together instructions that hopefully make sense and work right, predictably. Instead, we're building all this stuff out via containers, so that applications have all the dependencies they need. We know exactly what's required to run the application, using infrastructure as code to make sure that the development team and the sysadmins are working together to define that infrastructure, and it's built predictably every time. But ultimately, what we want to do is have our environments look exactly the same, whether they're on dev, QA, stage, or production. And so the really fun part about that is, as your processes around this mature, One of the nice side benefits is that when you bring new developers into the team, you can actually get a new developer set up with just a few clicks using these tools. And so it's really a great approach, and it has a long-lasting effect across the organization. So ultimately, though, by having all of these things scripted out so that there's no question about how environments are built or what applications need to run properly, it makes graceful recovery from failures much easier. So you might think of these 4 areas as your local data center. Maybe you got Amazon or Google or Azure. It allows you to have entire environments fail potentially and be automatically recreated by the machine without any intervention, and really preventing a lot of those problems. It also does some things that we've really taken advantage of lately, like feature switching. So if you only want to have a feature be visible to a few people to start with, that's really easy to do through these tools before you roll it out across the whole user base. Or things like canary staging, where you have that next release. You don't have to necessarily put it out for everyone. You can put it out for just a few users. And if it's a problem, then you can roll it back before it even affected your entire user base. So it's really this automation enables us to really focus on building great quality software instead of having to worry about things like deployment. So let's see, talking about DevSecOps and SecDevOps. Yeah, I don't know which is the correct thing. I hear both, so I clearly see you have the same question there. But I think really, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but from my perspective, the reason that we've put Sec into DevOps, whether you want to put it at the beginning or the middle, is because ultimately it's enabled us to actually run a lot of the security testing, like pen testing and things of that nature, as part of the deployment pipeline, and run it every single time we do a build, which historically has been really challenging. Historically, you had to spin up an environment, deploy the application to that environment, hope it's deployed the same way it looks on production in that environment, run those tests against that environment. But thanks to the miracle of continuous integration and continuous deployment, we can actually put in place those tools that do the security testing as part of the process on every single build, which is really fantastic. I hope I'm answering your question, but if not, feel free to expand on that a little bit. So again, the real culture hack here about deployment is that back in the day, developers were just throwing code over the wall to operations. They might have been giving them a scribbly notepad to say, hey, these are this you need to install, Java version blah, and running on this environment and so forth and so on. And it really ended up with a lot of tension between these groups, because not only was the operations guy learning very late in the game that he was going to have to do deployment, but he very often had incomplete and poor directions. But with containers and infrastructure as code, we ensure that the application works the same on all environments, resulting in less finger pointing. Those folks have worked together from the beginning to make sure they know how those environments should look and how they're going to look. And then you let the machine actually do the actual creating of instances, deploying of the applications, and et cetera, so you don't have to worry about whether you have the right guy in there when you're doing that deployment. And by the way, if you're just new to DevOps, or even if you've been around DevOps and you haven't heard about this book before, one of the reads that I picked up very early was the Phoenix Project. And my favorite character, which is of course a big character in that book, is Brent. And he was this guy that you couldn't deploy software anytime ever without Brent involved, because he knew where all the bodies were buried, and he was just too valuable. And so if he was out sick or if something happened to him, then the whole organization was really panicking because they couldn't deploy any applications or they couldn't fix any problems in the system. But by putting in place containers and infrastructure as code as part of a good CI/CD environment, you know that the tools are going to take care of those things. You don't have to worry about Brent being around making sure that we don't have any problems. So yeah, someone asked if that's the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim, and yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. And no, I'm not getting any residuals from that. I just love that book. It's fantastic. So let's see. I'm going to pick a quick question here randomly. How do you encourage a regular developer to become a test automation engineer, and where's the excitement in that field? So it's really interesting. We've had people come from both directions. So we've had people who have been good scripters who are kind of diving into building those environments. And we've also had QAs who have a little bit more technical background who have jumped over into it. And I'll tell you, I think for me, the reason that our QA architects are really excited about this field is that it's just changing so fast, and there's so many new, interesting, cool tools to use. And because, we're not just talking about testing web applications, we're talking about web applications, mobile applications. You're even talking about testing the back end, so running tests on APIs. And so from my perspective, it's just a constantly changing environment. And so for us, we actually got started building some of our own frameworks around QA automation, and that was pretty cool. But then quite frankly, some open source projects came along that were doing what we were trying to do even better. And we kind of dropped those and switched over to using some of these open source projects. So for me, and this is certainly what our QA automation engineers tell us, is that it's one of the fastest moving areas of software development, and with some of the coolest stuff going on. It's cool for me anyway, if you're a nerd like me. And so I think from that perspective, it's really exciting. And the nice thing is too, is you're coming into something very brand new, well, relatively brand new. There's not a lot of folks that have good coverage with this, and so there's a ton of opportunity there. And quite frankly, we even have some customers that have come to us just to help them get caught up with some of their QA automation. So there's also some great career opportunities there as well. So just a few quick words about monitoring. Really, the key here is that DevOps should enable every stakeholder in the organization and outside the organization to have visibility of what's going on. So we talked about orchestration. That ensures that environments are running well, but we also need to monitor with good monitoring tools on a number of levels. So instead of just making sure that maybe a piece of text is on a screen, we should also be monitoring APIs to make sure we're getting the kind of responses we want from that. We should be monitoring databases so we can look for simple things like, are we creating too many rows or not enough rows based on what we're expecting from the application? So monitoring has become a lot more sophisticated now. And again, as part of our DevOps lifecycle, we can implement some really great tools these days. But ultimately, we want to identify problems before anyone notices. So we want to make sure that people can come in and see what's going on so that it calms their nerves. And if you're like me, some of your favorite applications have screens where I can see in real time what's happening with those applications. And it's a great way to have your users feel like you actually have a real handle on what's going on. And again, we're not talking about preventing cover-ups. We do want to address problems in real time. We want to see issues before they become issues, not necessarily waiting until the system crashes. We do want to increase transparency. So not only is monitoring great at helping to prevent problems, but it's also great at giving a level of transparency to make your customers see that you actually care about their experience, and ultimately they'll value your software more. So really the key here is that, historically development teams have typically found out about problems when they had someone call in and say, hey, the system's down, or this part of the application is not working right. And the key as you're developing your DevOps processes is that you want to make sure that you have proactive monitoring in place at multiple levels in the application. You have a good strategy around that to make sure that not only are stakeholders protected from some preventable problems, but also that you're reducing the surprise from those problems and eliminating the blame game along the way. So again, the key here with using DevOps from my perspective, and we talked about this a lot, but it's about extending the Agile culture, getting everybody moving in the same direction. And that's what we really feel like it's all about at Globant as we work with our customers. So you guys were wondering about when our next poll was coming up. It's right now. And so the question is what do you hope to achieve with DevOps? And we have a couple of ways that you can respond to this poll. You can go to pollev.com/Globant. And by the way, that's also in the chat window there for those of you following along there. If you're in the US, you can send us a text to 22333. And if you don't have that window open already, type in Globant. But if you do have that window, you should still see it. The funny thing about this is I've given this presentation a lot of times, and very rarely do we see happier teams. Oh, good. Somebody cares about happier teams. Finally, somebody answered. 3% of you. Invariably, that pops up right when we say that. So I'm glad to see that. So higher quality releases. Yeah, again, I'm with you on that. I think ultimately nothing matters if we're not doing high quality releases. And I think DevOps is having the biggest impact of anything I've ever seen in terms of that. For those of you that are answering in the chat window to this question, again, you'll need to do that through our polling tool there. So just go to pollev.com/Globant, or you can text Globant to 22333 if you're in the US. So nice to see you guys are interested in higher quality releases, and certainly faster, more frequent delivery. There's no better way to keep your audience engaged than to be putting out those new features and bug fixes as fast as you can. And certainly better communication and collaboration. That's why I like to say we're extending this Agile model through the organization. And so 7% of you want happier teams. I hope you're answering that because you wanted to, not because I prompted you for that one. But I think it really does. I think we're avoiding a lot of the finger pointing that happens with traditional processes. And so certainly it's going to result in happier teams. And quite frankly, happier customers due to higher quality products is going to result in happier teams as well. So I have to say, if I were going to rank my priorities here, it might be something along this as well. So so good feedback there. Thank you. So ultimately at Globant, we're trying to get everyone talking, and so we're taking these silos, bringing them together, get everyone working together, and making sure that that we have success with DevOps, and that we have the team working and extending that Agile throughout the entire organization. So I think that's it for my presentation today. A quick word, then we'll go into QA. Again, you can find me everywhere on the internet at TURNEPF. I like to pronounce it TURNEPF. And as well, as I mentioned before, we do have a really great blog on our website. If you want to go straight there, if you use the bit.ly link, Globant Cloud Ops. Our Cloud Ops studio has a lot to say. You can see some stuff that I've written over the last few years on there as well. Certainly encourage you to visit that to read more about the bumps and bruises that we've had along our path of implementing DevOps in our organization. And certainly I would love to hear from you as well. So if you want to reach out to me after the presentation, you're welcome to do that. Like I said, I'm at TURNEPF on pretty much everything. I'm not on Snapchat yet, so my kids said it would be weird if I did that, so I haven't done Snapchat, but everywhere else pretty much you can find me at that location. So all right, I think we'll jump into Q&A, and I think Anna, how we got a couple more minutes here. I think we can.
Yeah, we got time.
All right, so I don't know, Anna, I think you were following the chat there better than I was. Any questions jump out to you that I should answer today, or try to answer?
There was one question about what's the best way to have an agile CI/CD process when you have big teams or multiple teams working on a project?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really it's a question we get a lot. And I think, in similar ways to the way Agile encourages you to break your teams up into smaller organization, whether you want to call that a pod or you want to call that a Scrum team. It's all about breaking up projects into those smaller components. So we generally shoot for a team size, including development and QA, of about 7 people. And I think that allows you to put together better strategies. I think there's some science that says groups that small communicate better and work better together. So if you have a team of 150 people, break it up into smaller chunks, have those teams work together in those smaller organizations, whether it's how they work with operations to build that CI/CD pipeline, or how they're actually putting together, let's say, their code branching strategies I was mentioning before. But ultimately, if you break it up into smaller pieces, it's going to make you sharing your code, doing those pull requests back into the master branch a little bit easier. And again, that smaller team's going to communicate together better and work better together. Anything else you want to throw out there for me today, Anna?
Cool. There is a question based on, does DevOps mean participating in every step of the software development lifecycle, including ops and QA, or collaborate with them, or both? Yeah,
so the ideal state for me, and this takes a while to get there, but all of these different team members are using different tools for their jobs, right? So you have development, and maybe they're using a task management tool, maybe Jira, for example. You have the QA team that has a repository for their test scripts where they're putting in all their test scripts into a repository. You have the CI/CD pipeline that is keeping track of those deployments. And ultimately, the tools are the things that you're going to want to make sure that you're connecting together. So for example, the team, the QA team that's putting together those test scripts should be tying those test scripts to tasks in Jira, or they call it issues. It's so funny they call it issues because not everything's an issue. And then you have the CI/CD pipeline where those builds are getting put together, and ultimately all of these things should be talking together so that everyone in the organization is working together, so that if they're not in the same room together, which I would encourage as well, at least the tools are showing them how things are working. So for example, when a build goes out, that build should be referring to the tasks that the developer did, or let's say the user stories that they worked against for that build. Those user stories are then tied to the test cases that are being managed in that test case management tool, so that the QA knows, okay, this build just went out. These are the Jira issues that are associated with it. These are the test scripts that were written in advance if we're doing development in that fashion, so that, for example, the QA knows exactly what the build is, where it is, the tasks that are involved, and the test cases that they should be using to test against. So that's an example of really how everyone in the organization should be using the tools to communicate and collaborate better together. And then because those things are all automated, it frees up their bandwidth in order to actually have the time to get in a room and talk to each other, so they can talk about what's going on, whether that's planning for the next release or talking about the challenges that they're facing based on the feedback they're getting from users, or what product management is asking them to do in their product roadmap.
Gotcha. Cool. I hope that answers that question. I see another one where somebody's asking, it's difficult to make the teams understand that it's not just automation, but that we also have to keep the manual testing in place. What do you suggest to keep the value of manual testing?
Well, I think ultimately, I think one of the key things in manual testing, and this is something I failed to mention earlier, but one of the ways that QAs can now leverage manual testing in much better ways is things like user experience, where historically, historically no one cared about user experience, but all of a sudden we realized that, hey, user experience can really define how that application is perceived by users. But ultimately, that tester is always going to be doing some manual work, but even for simple things like if it's a brand new feature, we're not going to have that automated test built yet for that new feature. We might be doing it while we're doing the manual testing, but we do want to make sure that that a person is actually reviewing that new feature to ensure that it works well, that there's no problems with it, that the user experience is good. Frankly, machines not yet are great at really having that sort of intelligence. So there's no AI, in my opinion, that's going to kind of give that feedback that an actual human being who understands the application can do when they review that application manually. Like I said, UX is a really important, critical part of it. But again, that's something that the QA traditionally, maybe they provided some feedback, this is hard to use, but that wasn't a real focus. But that gives them the opportunity, because you've automated a lot of the stuff that they used to have to spend most of their time doing, like regression testing. It frees up their time to be able to do more value-added testing, like UX testing.
Gotcha. Cool. We're seeing a couple of questions, a couple of repeat questions. One is about certifications and one's about tools. So I don't know how you want to tackle those.
I do know there's some certifications. I'm not fluent in what the certifications are, but I do know we have some team members who are starting to get some certifications, especially around QA automation in that area. I'm quite certain there are certifications for a lot of different areas. My personal opinion is that certifications are great just for giving yourself an idea of where you stand in things. I don't personally necessarily say that I'm more interested in how a person approaches things and their perspective than necessarily how much a certification is going to tell me. But I do think it's a great way to just see where you are in things, and quite frankly, even to learn. And I'm sorry, Anna, what was the other question?
Tools. Are there particular best tools for DevOps nowadays kind of thing?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned earlier, it's almost a religious question because a lot of people have their favorite tools and they believe they're the only way to go. I think, like I said before, Docker is sort of the gold standard for containers these days. I think that will be the case until it's not, which who knows what's going to happen next week or next year to change that. Kubernetes is certainly a huge player. For example, Docker had their own tools for that, and now they've actually adopted Kubernetes as the gold standard for how they define infrastructure. So that's really important. And I think in terms of source code management, Git has certainly come out to be the gold standard. Most of these have at least a basis on open source, which is great. And especially you think about tools like Git, the nice thing about that is there's lots of different options for how you actually use Git. So you can deploy it in your own data center if you want to. You can use tools like GitHub. If you want to go that way, there's Bitbucket, which is where we go because Bitbucket is a partner of Atlassian. We use both depending upon the customers that we're working with. But most of these tools are becoming more widely available, and definitely some of the cloud providers today are implementing some of these standard tools. They're doing some things of their own. But I tend to try to stay away from saying this is the best tool or that's the best tool because
Right.
since I slept last night, that rule may have changed because DevOps is definitely an area that is changing rapidly. And even though there's some tools that are bubbling to the surface of being sort of the gold standard, there's always something new happening and always some competitor that's coming along that's going to have a better alternative.
Cool. Another question was kind of going along on the same lines. Is there some particular role that could move into DevOps more easily than others? From a QC or from a dev perspective?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. I hesitated early on to even have this role of DevOps engineer because I really look at DevOps as being the responsibility of everyone in the organization. And so, as I said earlier, if you're talking about designing your infrastructure and the technology stack for your application, you really want to have many people involved in that pay. And the obvious ones are the development team and your sysadmins, your operations team. And those folks need to work together. But I think that everyone has some part of it because even from the perspective of a CI/CD pipeline, you're going to be wanting to work with the QA team to make sure that the tools that they want to leverage, whether it's for security or any other area, are going to play well together with those things. Now, I will say it's becoming easier and easier because more often these tools play well together. But and I think probably most people, when they think of DevOps engineer, they think of someone with a sysadmin background. But certainly, we have had senior engineers who really like manipulating continuous integration, continuous deployment environments that have moved into that role. We haven't had any QAs move into a quote unquote DevOps role, other than the fact that, like I said, they are influential in that process. But for us, it's typically been let's say traditional sysadmin or someone in the operations group or a more senior software engineer that have decided to move into that role where they're really helping to define the CI/CD environments.
Gotcha. Next question. What about database release automation from your perspective? We're having trouble with that.
Yeah, I tell you, people say when you say it's a good question, it's because you don't have a good answer. There are definitely some tools out there, and I know we've used some tools from Redgate to help in that process, but that's always been the most challenging part for me to wrap my head around. So, you have an application server, and if it dies, or if it has some issue, or let's say, God forbid, it's been hacked, you can just shut down that instance and let the machine bring another instance up. When you talk about databases, that's a less possible to do. I think one of the areas that we've certainly looked at is moving more toward an immutable database. so that you don't have necessarily just a single instance of a database that's subject to issues in terms of problems like that. And that certainly can address some of your issues in terms of deployment. But again, like I said, there are definitely tools, and like I said, Redgate comes to mind, where those tools can be implemented as part of your CI/CD pipeline to ensure that, for instance, if a table schema has to change as part of a deployment, that table schema is changing in the right instances that are being used by the right instances of the application. And so it's definitely a long, complicated process. And like I said, one of the last things that I still don't have my head around it 100%, but there are definitely some great tools out there that work as part of that pipeline to make sure that that the database setup in general is appropriate for the application versioning that's going out there, and it stays versioned, as well as dealing with some of the orchestration issues.
Cool. Quick one here. What technology do you prefer for DevOps? Anything in particular?
I think I've answered that question pretty well already. But I think the essentially talking about Git for source code management, Kubernetes for defining your environments, Docker for your containers, Selenium as a basis for QA automation. And again, there's a lot of open source frameworks and tools that you stack on top of Selenium depending upon the type of development that you're doing. Those are kind of the core from my perspective. I think in terms of task management, which I consider part of DevOps simply because that's the core of how we know what's going on in the pipeline. That's probably the set that I would talk about. But again, we're, especially as I mentioned before, around QA automation engineering, it is definitely a moving target, and there's a lot of new things that are constantly coming out that we're using and playing around with to make sure that we're doing the best possible automation around QA.
Cool. And then this question stood out to me. Can you envision a holistic approach to DevOps where design or DevOps can be included into the process?
Yeah, we actually, one of my colleagues actually has a presentation on DevOps, and so I am personally not fluent in that area, but I do think that it's important. And as I mentioned before, one of the areas that's really burgeoning is this whole notion of UX testing and how that can be addressed more effectively. So I don't have a great answer to that question. As I said, there are folks in our organization who have thought about it a lot and are actually doing some speaking on the topic around DevOps. But I think really ultimately at the end of the day, I mentioned DevOps, it's not about just taking Agile downstream to the operations group. It's also about going upstream to our product management, to our UX researchers and designers, so that they can be part of that process. And again, someone mentioned earlier in the word cloud about rapid deployment. And I think this is one of the things that I've learned about UX is that we can do a lot of research around user experience, but without putting the tool in front of users to really find out how they're using the tool and what's working and what's not working, we don't have a great idea for what's really happening in the wild. We've all used applications from big name software companies that that next release comes out and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't use this. Well, the wonderful thing about DevOps is that because we are doing rapid iteration, rapid deployment, frequent deployment, it gives us a lot of opportunities to get that feedback that we need for the design team to build more easily used software.
Cool. Well, unfortunately, I think we've run out of time allotted for the questions, but thank you to everyone who participated, to everybody who submitted their questions, and thank you, Patrick, for your insights and expertise.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great questions, everyone. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the interactivity today. It was a lot of fun.
Cool. And yeah, keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars. We'll let you know through email and through social media when we've got those coming up. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.